So, welcome back. If you watched the first part, if you didn't, you may want to go back and watch the first part of the origins of Islam that's on the Arabian context. The second part is going to focus solely on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, putting him in his original context and attempting to understand what it was that he understood himself to be doing. And I will just say right up front that I am looking at this as a historian who cannot measure belief, who cannot measure supernatural, who cannot measure motivations to go on inside someone's head. Instead, I look at social context, I look at actions, I look at religious devotion as it is presented by the actions of an individual or a community. So I am not going to attempt to claim any truth in terms of religious truth in one direction or another about the story of Muhammad. Instead, I want to put it in a context and say, how did it connect to the people that were experiencing at the time? And maybe the best way to do that is to start with a story of the childhood of Muhammad that is told by the first biographer of the Prophet Muhammad. And the first biographer of Muhammad relates a story to us about the Prophet's childhood. An orphan, he was the ward of his uncle Abu Talib, and his uncle, desiring to push him into adulthood as soon as possible, began taking Muhammad on long-distance caravan treks. These caravans were huge affairs, dozens or sometimes hundreds of camels carrying precious goods from India or further east, such as spices, silk, incense, and so on. And twice a year, the leaders of Mecca organized a major camel train to cover greater distances. At this time, from Mecca to Damascus in Byzantine Syria. This camel train had caused the old spice route, which passed through Petra to Wither, and these camel trains could have over 2,000 animals, covering a massive distance. Most of the men walked alongside the camels, loading and unloading in the evening, securing water through a hard route. And the biographer of Muhammad relates that as Abu Talib's section of the camel train entered Byzantine territory in modern-day Jordan, a lone monk was sitting in the ruins of a fortress on a high mountain which looked down on the route. The fortress was the ruin of a much earlier Roman garrison, which now, as Byzantium struggled to maintain its former glory, sat in ruins over a deserted road. The monk normally gave it no thought, content to remain alone in his thoughts, but devoted to God and tending his soul in solitude. The monk's name was Bahira. But on this day, he noted that a small lone cloud followed the caravan in an otherwise cloudless sky, hovering low over one particular point in the caravan. Recognizing it as an omen, he broke his usual practice and went out to invite everyone in the caravan to be his guest and share in his food. But when the traders entered, he sensed that someone was missing. He questioned them closely, at which they acknowledged they had left the camel boy with the camels. Bahira insisted that the boy be brought in. They had him stand, and Bahira examined his torso to search for the so-called seal of the prophethood. This is undefined, but sometimes shows up in other sources as a birthmark between the shoulder blade or a third nipple in some of the Buddhist traditions. Whatever he was looking for, Bahira found it. He declared him, according to a later biographer, quote, "A great future lies before this nephew of yours." And I like this story because it illustrates the complicated beginnings of the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the religion of Islam. It illustrates the beginning as a truly historical context, even if the story itself isn't perfectly true, because it affirms the importance of trade, of prestige goods, of battle between trade routes as a proxy for control, of the presence of a Roman legacy, and the weakness of the current empire, and the relationship between Arabia and the rest of the New East. Even the religious elements are part of a broader framework. The holy hermit, with his evocation of both Christian and Buddhist monks, the mark of a prophet, the respect for a Christian monk among Arab traders. These all speak to, if not a shared religion, a shared religious milieu, right? Wherein there were differences about the nature of ritual and holiness, but a shared belief in the supernatural and its manifestation in daily life. Finally, I like the story because it expresses so clearly the problem of studying early Islamic history. The source of this work is the first biographer, the Prophet Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq. It's supplemented by the works of al-Tabari, the second major biographer. Ishaq wrote in 777 and al-Tabari in 915. These are the two earliest witnesses to an account which claims to have happened around 580 590? This is roughly the same as one of us recounting a family tale of an ancestor in the American Civil War, or possibly even the American Revolutionary War. So what I'd like to ask in this lecture and the following one is three big questions, which assume the past is unlike the present and change is the only real constant. So I'm going to try to rely only on sources which come from the 7th century that are contemporaneous with the life of Muhammad or with his immediate successors. And this is a break with traditional histories of Islam. But my point is that we can't trust those sources that come later for exactly the reason that my preceding point laid out: change. The earliest sources written by Ibn Ishaq date to 777 and after. These are so far removed that when they imagine the movement at its birth, the sources see what it will become. And so, like so many religious groups, they don't allow for change. They view the religion as ahistorical and assert that the religion sprung fully formed and developed. And this is not unique to Islam. The same thing happens in Christianity. The same thing happens with Mormonism, with any number of groups. To deal with this problem, we try to limit ourselves to what we can see from contemporaries only. So let's start with our first big question. What did the movement that Muhammad began look like during the life of Muhammad? Right? And to do this, we need to look at the life of Muhammad, at his teachings. Right? Tradition places the year of Muhammad's birth as corresponding with the year of the elephant that I talked about at the end of the last lecture, which is named after the failed destruction of Mecca that year by Abraha, Yemen's king, Himyar's king, who supplemented his army with elephants. Muhammad's father, Abdullah, died almost 6 months before he was born. And according to tradition, soon after birth, the Prophet Muhammad was sent to live with a Bedouin family in the desert, as desert life was considered healthier for infants. Some Western scholars reject that tradition's historicity. Right. Mecca had become a major city in the previous 2 generations as it controlled the trade routes across the Arabian Peninsula, the overseas land routes. Right. So if you wanted to bypass the sea route that went through the Red Sea and through the Bab al-Mandab, or the route that went along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Persian Gulf, both of which were controlled by Persia by 575, you went overland through Mecca. Mecca itself had in its center the Kaaba, a place of worship which was believed to have been set up by Abraham, who is thus holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Over the years, other objects of worship might have been added, but it's unclear. Some sources mention 365 idols, one for every day of the year, others none. But the important part of it was a smooth black stone, which seems to be meteoric in origin. The presence of the holy site, the Kaaba in Mecca, was important for 2 reasons. One, it was a site for pilgrims, right, who came to spend money then in the city and as a place of reverence. But second, it was a sacred space, which meant the city of Mecca was sacred, and thus it was forbidden to take weapons inside the city boundaries. And this is not unusual in the ancient world. Many cities are weapon-free zones. That's how you can be safely within a city with such a dense appeal, is that there are no weapons allowed. It also thus makes it a really good place to do business, right? To set up your stalls, because you know you are far less likely to be robbed. And so Mecca emerges as a center of religion and of trade. Muhammad was born into the Quraysh tribe, the most important tribe, but the least powerful clan within that tribe, the Hashim. And so he was cared for by his clan, specifically his uncle, Abu Talib, took him in as his father had died before he was born, and his mother died by the time he was about 4 or 5. While his uncle took him in and ensured he did not starve, the reality is that life must have been hard for an orphan. He began working on caravans at an early age. His experience, though, paid off for him, and he began an established caravan driver in his early 20s. His reputation as an upstanding man spread, and it won the admiration from an older woman, Khadijah, so that proposed to him. She was 40 in 595, and he was supposedly 25. And though while she had her pick of men, she chose the much younger Muhammad. Her father, though, did not agree. So, as the legend goes, she invited Muhammad over for dinner, invited her father over for dinner, plied him with wine until she proposed the union to him, and him being happy and drunk, agreed. Gaining his consent, she wed Muhammad that very night before he could sober up. While she lived, Muhammad took no other wives. And their union is a special one. I want to highlight it as she was the first believer of his teaching, the first Muslim, and she always was held on a pedestal by Muhammad. Even his later wives, who came only after she was dead, commented and felt that they felt insecure. Maybe his most famous younger wife, Aisha, said, Aisha did not nurse such strong feelings of jealousy toward any wife of the Messenger of Allah as she did towards Khadijah. The reason for this jealousy was that Khadijah had made a place for herself in the heart of her husband which no one else could take. Muhammad recounted her merits night and day. Muhammad was constantly helping the poor and the sick. On one occasion, Aisha asked him the reason for this, and he said, Khadijah had told me to treat these people with kindness and love. It was her last wish. When Aisha heard this, she flared into a rage and shouted, Khadijah, Khadijah, it seems for you there is no other woman on the face of the earth except Khadijah. The apostle was a man of unlimited forbearance, but when he saw Aisha's outburst, he stopped talking with her. And this story illustrates the importance of his first wife in shaping the man he would become. And in this way, his experience is perhaps different than those of the average Arabian man at the time. He marries a woman already established, who already had a husband, who had passed away, who has wealth, and is significantly older than he is. Most marriages of the ancient world are the opposite. They have a much older man to a younger woman that reinforces ideas of patriarchy and male dominance. His wife, Khadijah, is a very strong woman in her own right who chooses him. That's exceptional. And it sets their marriage in a much different light than any other marriage of the period, and I think is important for us to reflect on. But the story of Muhammad perhaps really begins in the year 610. That is the year he turned 40, which was viewed in the Arabian and ancient world as the year someone finally grew fully into adulthood and became a man. He also went through what we might call a midlife crisis. He sought deeper meaning, and Khadijah urged him to seek solitude and began to retreat to a cave on a mountain near Mecca to pray and seek meaning. And there, traditions hold that the angel Gabriel, the same angel who announced the coming of Christ to Mary in the Christian New Testament, spoke to Muhammad. The Gabriel commanded Muhammad to recite the words of God, and these words would eventually become the Quran, though not for many years. Muhammad returned home to tell his wife, who became the first believer, the first Muslim. But upon his return to the cave, there was silence. For 3 years, Muhammad returned with nothing. God was silent. This initial revelation, and followed by a 3-year pause, led Muhammad to feel depressed and further gave himself to prayers and spiritual practices. When the revelations resumed, he was commanded to preach his message to the people of Mecca. Now, if we look at how Muhammad describes this in the earliest preaching that comes in the Quran, it emphasizes a few things that are not surprising. Belief in one God, monotheism, prayer, charity, honesty, and a coming day of judgment. We should note that none of these things were exceptional in that world. Throughout the Near East, monotheism in the form of Judaism and Christianity was omnipresent. Various forms of Christianity fought with each other, but paganism, as we typically think about it, while still possibly present, was no longer the norm. Apocalyptic beliefs, the belief in the coming into the world, have been growing since the plague of 541. And in Arabia, traditionally, Arabia has been portrayed as a backward region with numerous idols and gods and practices which Muhammad brought into monotheism. But I don't know that this is a fair history. Rather, I think it's a story designed to separate Islam from Christianity or Judaism. Because the reality seems to be that Arabia was no more polytheistic than anywhere else in the Near East. One proof is that we have numerous examples of religious violence. Christianity and Judaism were well known and established in the peninsula. Christians and Jews attacked each other and fought about who was right. Christian on Christian violence was expected throughout Egypt, Arabia, Palestine, and nearby regions. Even in Mecca and among the Arabs, the reality was that monotheism of variety was already the norm. Among the Arabs, there was a common belief in a supreme God, Allah, which is simply the Arabic word for God. Beneath him were other lesser deities of differing importance and utility. Later Muslims see this as polytheistic, but was it really? I challenge this in 2 ways. First, both Judaism and Christianity accept a host of lesser supernatural deities that can be accessed and used depending on the situation. Christians frequently implore the Virgin Mary or saints in their prayers, and these are semi-divine beings similar to heroes of ancient myth. Their deeds in life had granted them unique knowledge or connection to the divine. Judaism had a complex belief in angels and their powers. And what is an angel if not a lesser supernatural being? Is an angel the equal of the supreme God? No. All would deny that. But does believing in other supernatural beings mean you are not monotheist? And this is where I want to problematize these definitions a little bit. So what did Muhammad emphasize to people who would follow him? Belief in one God, but then prayer, charity, and honesty. And the name that he gives them, they are the community of believers. Right? The term Muslim shows up in the Quran, but much less in the term believer, mu'minun. Muhammad and the Quran seem to distinguish between those who submit, which is what Muslim means, one who submits, and those who believe. And we can note that the Quran addresses overwhelmingly people whom it calls believers, mu'minun. In this, it differs from the traditional Muslim narratives and from modern practice, both of which routinely refer to Muhammad and his followers mainly as Muslims, Muslimum, literally, those who submit, and refer to his movement as Islam. And it is true, the words Islam and Muslim appear in the Quran. And it's also true that these words are sometimes applied in the text to Muhammad and his followers. But those instances are dwarfed by the cases in which Muhammad and his followers are referred to as mu'minun, believers, which occurs almost 1,000 times throughout the Quran, compared to 75 instances of Muslim. Later tradition, beginning about a century after Muhammad, came to emphasize the identity of Muhammad's followers as Muslims and attempts to neutralize the importance of the many passages in which they are called believers by portraying the two terms as synonymous and interchangeable. But a number of Quranic passages make it clear that the words mu'minun and Muslim, although evidently related and sometimes applied to the same person, cannot be synonyms. For example, 49:14, the believers say, "We believe." Say to them, "You do not believe, but rather say, 'We submit,' for belief has not yet entered your hearts." We can clearly see the separation between those who submit and those who believe, with belief being a superior second step. Christians and Jews are commonly referred to in the text as peoples of the book, a phrase meant to denote their reliance on holy text, which the believers viewed positively. But this was not meant to be a full separation. See the next examples, 3:199. There are among the peoples of the book, Christians and Jews, those who believe in God and what was sent down to you and was sent down to them. Same book, 1:13-1:16. Among the peoples of the book are an upright company. They recite God's verses through the night while prostrating themselves. They believe in God and the last day and enjoin kindness and forbid abominations and hasten to do good things. These are among the righteous ones. For no good thing that they will do will be passed over without thanks, for God knows the pious. But those who disbelieve, neither their wealth nor their children will be of any help to them against God. Those are the companions of hellfire, they shall be in it forever. And then 29:46, do not debate with the people of the book except by what is best, meaning with courtesy, nicely, except those of them who do evil. Say, we believe in what was revealed to us and revealed to you. Our God and your God is one, and to him we submit. What we see in these texts is an emphasis on belief, not submission, right? On the term belief, believers, those who believe. And what's clear is that the people of the book can overlap with those believers. And this is my first big point about what Muhammad teaches, is that this is a very simple teaching. It is monotheism. It is perhaps a reform of monotheism that existed in Arabia. We might even call it simply a reformed Judaism. Now that's a vast oversimplification, I understand that. Maybe we see it in the Shahada, right? The Shahada is the statement of faith for Muslims. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Yes, after 685. Prior to the year 685, the Shahada was, there is no God but God. The second clause is added in 685 to create a separation. We'll talk about in the next lecture. Prior to 685, who can say there is no God but God? Christians, Jews, followers of Muhammad? Absolutely. And so one of my arguments is that prior to the end of the 7th century, this movement that Muhammad begins is much broader than we have been led to expect. Maybe we see that in some stories, right? The night journey, maybe one of the most famous stories of Muhammad other than his flight from Mecca. The night journey is the story of him sleeping one night, wherein he is transported first to Jerusalem. And then from Jerusalem, he steps onto the rock that is underneath the Dome of the Rock today, right, where Al-Aqsa Mosque is, where the Jewish temple formerly was, and climbs into heaven. He ascends into heaven and meets all of the previous saints and prophets that have come before, including Abraham and Jesus and Moses. This location is not lost on us. How do you get to heaven? You go to Jerusalem. Right? He can't ascend directly into heaven from Mecca, apparently. You go to Jerusalem to go to heaven. And it very much takes the former things that are already established, Judaism and Christianity, and is saying, I'm taking them and I'm using them in something new. I am reforming them. And it shows this connection. Other points of connection is that if we read the Quran, we see emphasis on the Prophet Moses and on Mary, the mother of Jesus. One of the things that my Muslim friends love to point out to me, Mary is mentioned more in the Quran than she is the Christian New Testament. Right? There's more reverence for her there than in the Christian New Testament. And it speaks to this shared milieu that is too often overlooked. Now, there is no mention of Muhammad being called prophet or apostle by any outside source until the 8th century. He is instead called leader, he is called teacher, but those other titles are applied later. So what do we see here? We see a movement which emphasizes monotheism across traditions and practices, prayer, fasting, alms, that were common across traditions already. Now, to kind of talk a little bit about Muhammad's life, it's important to kind of think about this in stages, but I'm focusing here on this early stage when he is still in Mecca. In the year 619, his uncle, Abu Talib, and his wife, Khadijah, both die. His own clan disowns him, and it speaks to his loss of safety, we might say. His followers number maybe in the hundreds, but he's approached by leaders of the city of Medina, Yathrib, to come and be their arbiter and leader. And so he leaves Mecca in 622. What does he do when he gets to Medina? He builds his first mosque for prayer. The direction of prayer is not towards Mecca, as we might expect today. We know Muslims pray towards Mecca, and eventually Muhammad does make that change. But initially, when he gets to Medina, the direction of prayer is to Jerusalem. Jerusalem still as that center, is the city that is holy to Jews and to Christians, and it seems to Muhammad. But when he enters Medina, he has some problems, specifically economic. Mecca is a trading city. Medina is an agricultural one. So what can newcomers do who don't have land, who, they can work as migrants, but they resort instead to the raiding of caravans and cities. And this is successful, and some other local tribes pledge their allegiance to Muhammad, and they are called Muslims, those who submit, right, in difference to mu'minim, those who believe. This success raises the hackles of the leaders in Mecca, and there a man by the name of Abu Sufyan, leader of the Umayyad clan, raises an army to besiege Medina in 625. And there's a host of battles here that I'm not going to delve into all of the history here that is out there. If you are interested in it, I highly encourage you to go read up on it. The one that I will highlight is the Battle of Uhud, right, where the city of Medina is laid siege to by the Meccan fortresses, or by the Meccan forces. Muhammad leads his troops out, and he is cut down. The camel goes out from under him, he falls, and his followers believe he has died. They flee. Muhammad survives wounded, and he corrects the people and said, do you believe that the prophet could really be harmed? You showed your cowardice and lack of belief. But the Meccans win the day. One important moment that happens here is that Muhammad's uncle Hamza is slain by the slave of Abu Sufyan's wife, Hind. She runs out onto the battlefield and cuts open Muhammad's uncle, cuts out his liver, grabs it and takes a bite out of it, chews it, and then spits and stomps on it. This is a sacrilege Right? The liver was believed to be the source of the soul, much like we talk about having a heart today, and we mean that metaphorically, as that's where our soul, our spirit resides. The liver was believed to be that in the ancient world because it was the largest organ. And so to be doing this was to literally like stomp on his soul. Abu Sufyan apologizes for the actions of his wife, but I highlight this because it's going to be an important part of where we go. Over time, we could recount numerous battles of Muhammad in the intervening years. He won more Bedouins and local tribes to his position. So in 630, he lays siege to Mecca, and Abu Sufyan rode out to submit and to recognize his leadership. Muhammad supposedly goes in, purges the Kaaba of idols, and then sat to accept the allegiance of the Meccans who had driven away. On the third day, the wife of Abu Sufyan, Hind, the woman who had eaten his uncle's liver, came. She submitted and offered her son. Muhammad forgave her and took her son, Muawiyah, as his personal secretary. And I note this because Muawiyah, that son of the woman who ate Muhammad's uncle's liver, will be the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, really the first caliph. Right, we'll talk about the deputies that follow, but Muawiyah is the person who really makes a caliphate. And it's fascinating that that's by forgiveness. Muhammad passes away 2 years later in 632 in Medina. When he dies, he leaves no clear successor, and that's going to be one of the problems we're going to wrestle with in the next lecture. But if we come back to our question, that when Muhammad passes away, we find that Arabia is now united under a single group. It is unclear whether that is fully religious or political or both, and what exactly that religion is. But what it seems to be is that it is an ecumenical movement founded on simplicity, right? An ecumenical reform movement. It's open to all, right? Any peoples of the book. It was simple. It's not rigorous. Perhaps it's better to think of it as a reform movement rather than an entirely new religion. It doesn't have a written text yet. It doesn't have ways to join clearly yet. It doesn't have clear separation from peoples of the book yet. Rather, it's simply a reform movement. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to ask the question of, well, why does it succeed? And then, importantly, why does it become Islam?